Hello, Ian. I was wondering if you could introduce yourself to everyone.
Sure, I'm Ian Dallas. I'm the creative director at Giant Sparrow, and we just finished our first game, The Unfinished Swan, for the PlayStation Network.
Awesome. Thanks for coming in today, and joining us for kind of a new thing we're doing here, like a little post-mortem. First off, congratulations.
Thanks.
I personally enjoyed the game quite a bit. It was a lot more than I ever expected it to be. And I guess my first question is just, as the creator and on a small team, what is your reception to the reception that you've been receiving? And it has, it hasn't all been high praise and kudos. There's been some critical reception out there as well.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I think right now it feels very polarized, that we've gotten people that absolutely love the game, and then people that kind of almost hate the game. Hate is maybe a little too strong, but the interesting thing for us, looking at least critically, where you can see someone who actually goes on for a page about what they like and don't like, is that a lot of people really like things about the game that are the exact same elements that other people, make other people dislike the game. So things like the length of the game, the fact that there are, it's a game about discovery, and it's focused on a bunch of mechanics that you kind of learn over the course of the game, but don't really come back to. And a lot of games really drill deep into one or two mechanics, and this is a game that goes a different way. And some people really like that, and then other people feel like, I don't know if some of it is that they feel like games have to be a certain way, or that they're just more comfortable, or if they feel like they understand that maybe we went off in this direction, but they don't think we did a good job. But it's interesting to see that it's not that some people are ignoring things that other people dislike. It's just the game really appeals strongly to some people, and then other people, just for whatever reason, it doesn't hit them in the same way.
Now, labels exist obviously for a reason. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. And the word indie game is getting thrown around all the time. And we see indie games everywhere. And they're even coming to consoles, as you guys and your comrades over at That Game Company with Journey and Flower and Flow. But I also think there's kind of a level of an indie game and then an experimental game. And I was curious if you had any thoughts on that, and where maybe The Unfinished Swan may kind of sit in that kind of pantheon of game types that are kind of erupting everywhere the last couple years.
Well, I think it's a little hard to describe us as an indie studio, even though I think we have an indie spirit, and a lot of us had never made a game before. So it certainly wasn't a professional operation for most of the development. But at the same time, we're located within Sony's offices and are getting a ton of support from Sony, both financially, and then also equipment and advisors and all kinds of stuff that a traditional indie team working out of a basement or wherever is not going to have. So I think the thing as a developer that's really interesting to me is that we've sort of got the best of both worlds, hopefully, with an idea, like a premise, and a goal as far as creating a game that's about awe and wonder that you'd never see in a AAA game. But then we also are able to take enough time and throw enough resources at it to make something that is a much more fully featured exploration of that idea than you would otherwise get a chance to if you were an indie. So it's, we're hopefully again trying to find a balance there of this sort of crazy weird idea, but partnered with something that is a little bit more standard in terms of having a 3-year development cycle and a fairly large team to explore those things that you'd find in a more AAA game.
Now, we saw this game years back. I believe it was at GDC.
Yeah, I think in 2009. Yeah.
I guess going back to the previous two questions, when we're talking about length, some people thought the game was short. It's obviously not a full-priced game. And then, I feel like a lot of people, what they want in a review is how long was the game and give me a numerical score for how good it was. Mm-hmm. But, it's good to critique things as well. But you also mentioned, you had a 3-year development cycle. What changed? What sort of, when you're the creative director, where were the big changes? And we're going to talk about spoilers. The game's out. This is for people who are familiar with the game, hopefully. Where were the big changes in that 3-year process in creating the game?
Well, I think it's hard for me to even remember back to the beginning of the game what we thought it was going to be. We have a design document from the very beginning of the project which outlines, I think, pretty accurately what the feel of it was going to be. that we always knew this was going to be a game, that was trying to inspire this sense of curiosity and awe and wonder, and the sort of concrete implementation of that was something that just sort of accreted on over time. That we found things that sort of helped to flesh out the experience, and we started with the mechanic of the white room and black paint, so we were pretty good there. I think we always knew how the game was going to begin. And early on, we knew what who the player was. The idea that you were a young boy chasing after a swan was there from day one. But the king character didn't exist until maybe a year to a year and a half ago, and that was something that arose out of in making these spaces and thinking about what would an unfinished world look like. We started to create these very elaborate environments in this huge city and labyrinths, and it just felt like that was going to be the most interesting thing, that the game was really about an exploration of space in terms of the mechanics. And so, we added this king character as a guy who created this world so that as you were exploring it as a player, there's the moment-to-moment spatial exploration, but then there's also the kind of longer narrative arc of exploring who would create this kind of a world. What is this world telling me, in terms of the story, just in the architecture. We tried to make the architecture tell a little bit of the story there. And so, I think the development of the game was a series of small steps of things, discovering them that like, oh yeah, that feels pretty good, and then really just playing the game a whole bunch ourselves. And there's like another kind of random example. Over the course of the game, in the early days, we found that the game was fairly lifeless. That when it's just a white world, splat in black paint, you end up with kind of a static, cold feeling. And so we were looking for things that would add a bit of color and movement and life and kind of lighten the tone. And we were also at the same time looking for a collectible potentially, for something to encourage players to go down a path. And I think we all felt a little reticent about throwing in, floating coins or any kind of random thing, that it just felt a little gamey for us, that it didn't feel like it'd be a good match for the game. And one of the artists suggested that we put balloons in there. And suddenly it all just clicked. That it's like, oh, well, balloons would be like a great thing to collect. They're colorful and have this kind of childlike sensibility. They move around and add life. And so really it was just a kernel of an idea in the beginning of what sort of feeling we wanted. And then as we went along, we found what was missing from the game, and then sort of like little ideas that built on top of it. So the balloons added, and then all the other elements just sort of kept building on to the rest of the game.
Ah, it's you, the boy from my dream. What a strange dream it was.
To go actually back to the story and the king in particular, one, how did you get Terry Gilliam to do the voice? And it's funny because the movie has a real Time Bandits feel, or I'm sorry, the game has a real Time Bandits feel to it, where it's like, I'm assuming you've seen Time Bandits?
Yeah. It's one of my favorite films.
You find it, you find that movie in the kids section or the family section at a movie store, but it's always that kind of like, it's a little darker, like it's pure evil, Mom.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if you could actually talk about the story behind getting Terry Gilliam to voice the king, and maybe a little bit about the kind of, maybe the audience, like the game speaks for itself, the sense of wonder and stuff, but maybe the kind of audience you were going for with the story as well?
Yeah, so, for as far as getting Terry Gilliam, that was a pretty easy story. We asked him, and he said yes. So there's not a whole lot to tell there. I think, by that time, we had a very good idea what the story was. We had lines for him, and he could see it, and so he just, liked the idea of the game, and I think what we had, and I think maybe part of the reason he likes it is that it is, subconsciously and somewhat consciously based on Time Bandits. I mean, that was definitely, Alice in Wonderland is the biggest inspiration for the game in terms of the overall, narrative arc and stuff. But Time Bandits is a close second. That was something that we looked at as a team, and really glommed onto early on, this idea of, a child exploring this, totally fantastical space that is, and I think there's, mature element in Time Bandits as well that we have in our game that is just something that I think most of the storybook influences that we looked at had, for a lot of the same reasons. That, being a child, if you're exploring what it feels like there's a pretty dark element to that. That, as a child, not knowing what's out there and being prey to all kinds of really powerful forces, I mean, it's all sort of part of the same, if you're gonna honestly look at what it feels like to be a child, you can't help but introduce, some of those darker elements into it.
Going back to the mechanics, it's funny because what you said about how you felt like maybe people weren't didn't get to have enough time with certain things. Your game actually, in a weird way, reminds me of the first Metal Gear Solid, because you kept like Snake kept getting a certain technology, and then the tutorial for it was not just a kind of a boring tutorial. It was actually a fun way to use it, and it did become kind of the repertoire, but usually it wasn't maybe so much more in the forefront. I was curious, how do you guys like? I felt like the vines were used like the perfect amount. But later on with the three-dimensional, I'm not sure what you called that mechanic exactly.
Oh, box drawing?
The box drawing. I felt like that was maybe a little underused.
Yeah.
But it was also a little more complicated as well. I'm just curious, like, where did you guys try to find that balance? Because you are constantly inventing new stuff. And like even after the whole first chapter, just adding the idea of hitting the physics paddles, it brought me back a little bit to like Half-Life 2. You know, physics are fun. It doesn't necessarily have to be complicated. It's just something you can work with. But where do you find that balance of introducing something and letting it run its course without beating someone over the head with it, but also feeling like they're having a good time, they're having fun, they're being rewarded?
I think for Unfinished Swan, our goal was really to evoke a sense of discovery, so that players always felt like there was something unknown that was out there, that they got these new vines and they're learning all these things about them, and it's really, it's a game about learning, and in that way it's sort of, hopefully reminiscent to people's childhood, time where there's all these things that you don't know and you're constantly learning new things. So for us, the point where we felt like in watching playtests that, okay, like we've done it, we should be moving on, is when people stopped learning. So if we had already taught people everything there is to know about splatting or vine growing or box drawing, then after that we're really just challenging them, and that's fine. That's a fun activity in a lot of games, but that's not what this game was about. This game was about trying to keep people learning all the time, and so in terms of the pacing and how long people spent with each of the mechanics, it was really just something that came out of watching playtests. That when we found that most people had kind of understood what was going on, then we're like, okay, well let's move on. I think looking back on it, we wish that the vine growing was actually a little bit shorter. And
really?
Yeah, it used to be much longer. I think now, it probably takes people around 45 minutes to an hour to get through the vine growing section. It used to take about 2 hours. About a year or two ago, when we first put that whole village or the Unfinished Empire chapter together, it was around 2 hours or so, and we took out a lot of dead spaces there. And there's an area that we really wanted to condense towards the seawall, where we kind of wanted to rotate the world around. But that late in development, it's pretty hard to cut out big chunks, and so we ended up with around 5 or 10 minutes extra of vine growing, which when you read critic reviews, there are people that say like, oh, it's just perfect, and then there's also like a fair number of people saying, oh, maybe it's a little bit long. So I feel like we probably could have shortened that a little bit. The box drawing is something that I think of all the mechanics we probably wish could have been a little bit longer, but it was on the chopping block for so long, and the fact that we got it in at all was sort of a minor
it does
miracle.
start with a great playground. You do get a lot of playground space of that particular mechanic.
Yeah.
But speaking of mechanics, I have a little treat. You brought in a concept that was on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
Could you maybe explain the?
Sure. This was one of the things that it's a mechanic that we called river painting, and the idea is that you throw your water balls, and then it creates a puddle, and then the puddle is actually like 10 feet deep. And it was just it seemed like a really interesting, surreal idea. There's actually a moment in Eraserhead that uses this exact same idea of like a puddle that ends up being super deep. And we got far enough into actually implementing it, and we had it in game, and we had a little scene where you could draw a river from a current source and then activate a watermill. But then after you activated the watermill, we never really figured out what was next. There's nothing else that was like, oh, this would be awesome. It was like a fun idea that didn't translate into anything that felt like it was satisfying gameplay. And so we probably spent like 4 to 6 months making this thing, and then kind of heart-wrenchingly had to throw it away. But it's not that bad because it never play tested that well. It wasn't.
So it won't be DLC.
Unlikely, strongly unlikely.
Well, are you going to get David Lynch in your next game? Because he's been doing a lot of stuff like Louis C.K., and I think he's done some Seth MacFarlane cartoons as well.
Yeah, we would love to get David Lynch involved. We'll have to see if we can find a place for him.
I was just going to give you my personal, the only spot in the game I was stuck.
Yeah.
You have to make a running jump onto a half ladder towards the start of the town, and I could not do it. I had to jump on the little barrier and do it that way. It was also, I will say your move controls are actually pretty good for your like level of inertia and sweeping, but that was the one that got me the most. Speaking of the move controls, was that kind of a...
You mean the PlayStation Move?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Was that kind of a make good with Sony, or is that something you guys wanted to do from the get-go?
That was definitely something Sony wanted to do from the get-go. This was before the Move had even been announced. So they were looking at the game, potentially even thinking of it as a Move-exclusive game in the early days. And we ended up, in that negotiation saying, okay, well, we'll support the Move, but we also felt like we wanted to support the DualShock as well. And it's something we developed pretty much in tandem, which, looking back on it, may be a mistake. In the early days, the PlayStation Move hardware was pretty unreliable, and there were tons of bugs that we found that turned out to be just like, bugs in the Sony code for doing it because it hadn't been released yet. But shortly thereafter, starting development, we had Move support in, and would play with DualShock and Move at the same time. I think it's tricky to play the game with just the Move, and that's something that I'm happy that we can support, because there are a lot of people out there that don't have a navcon to play with. But certainly the game is easier if you have a separate joystick for moving around, and then you can use the Move just to look up and down. If you're playing with just the Move, we're very limited with the number of buttons that you have, that we're kind of hitting our limits there. So it's a little more tank-like in terms of moving forward and backward. That can definitely get trickier for some of the platforming areas.
Well, the Unfinished Swan, I thought it was very good. I hope people enjoy it. And you're on the line to do a couple more games for Sony, right?
Yeah, we have a 3-game deal, so this is the first of those 3 games.
Well, I look forward to checking out those other games. Maybe we'll have you back, maybe even a little bit before that. Thank you for stopping by.
Oh, my pleasure.